The fluorescent lights in the emergency room buzzed with that sterile, relentless hum that seems to drain hope from the air. It was 3 in the morning at St. Catherine's Medical Center, and the waiting room held the kind of silence that comes when people are too tired, too worried, or too broken to speak. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something sharper, something that tasted like fear when you breathed it in. In the corner, near the vending machines that hadn't worked in weeks, a young woman sat hunched over in a plastic chair. Her name was Maya Torres, and she was 28 years old, though tonight she looked a decade older. Her hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled tissue, her knuckles white from the pressure. She wore a faded blue jacket over a waitress uniform, the name tag still pinned to her chest. The jacket had a small tear near the shoulder, carefully stitched with thread that didn't quite match. Maya's eyes were red and swollen, her face streaked with tears she'd stopped trying to hide. Every few seconds, she'd glance toward the double doors that led to the treatment rooms, as if willing them to open, as if her desperation alone could summon good news. But the doors stayed closed, and with each passing minute, the weight on her chest grew heavier. The tissue in her hands had been twisted and untwisted so many times it was falling apart, small white pieces gathering in her lap like snow. She didn't notice. Her gaze had fixed on those double doors with an intensity that made her eyes burn, made them water even more, but she couldn't look away. Wouldn't look away. Because the moment she did, the moment she let her guard down, something terrible might happen behind those doors, and she wouldn't be ready for it. Beside her sat a small backpack, the kind children take to elementary school. It was purple with a fading unicorn printed on the front. Inside were things no mother should have to carry to a hospital at 3 in the morning. A change of clothes for her daughter, a stuffed rabbit with one ear shorter than the other, a juice box, and every medical document they'd accumulated over the past 6 months. The backpack sat between Maya's feet like an anchor, keeping her tethered to reality when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. She'd packed that bag 4 hours ago, her hands shaking so badly she'd dropped the rabbit twice. Emma had been seizing in the bedroom, her small body rigid on the bed, and Maya had been stuffing clothes into the backpack with one hand while calling 911 with the other. The operator's voice had been calm, too calm, asking questions Maya barely heard over the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears and Emma's labored breathing. The ambulance had taken 11 minutes to arrive. Maya knew because she'd counted every second, kneeling beside Emma's bed, holding her daughter's hand, whispering promises she had no right to make. "It's going to be okay, baby. You're going to be fine. Mommy's here. Mommy's not going anywhere." 11 minutes that felt like 11 hours. Her daughter, Emma, was somewhere behind those doors. 7 years old. Fever of 104 degrees. Seizures that had started 2 hours ago and wouldn't stop. This wasn't the first time. It was the 4th time this month, and each time was worse than the last. Maya had carried Emma into the emergency room 40 minutes ago, her little girl's body convulsing in her arms, and the nurses had immediately taken her back. The automatic doors had whooshed open and Maya had rushed through them, Emma heavy and hot against her chest, and suddenly there had been people everywhere. Hands reaching for Emma, voices firing questions, a gurney appearing from nowhere, someone trying to pry Emma from her arms, and Maya not wanting to let go, not wanting to release her daughter into the hands of strangers even though she knew she had to, even though these were the people who could help. "Ma'am, we need you to let go. Ma'am, we need to get her on the gurney." And Maya had released her grip, had watched them lay Emma on the thin mattress, watched her daughter's eyes roll back, watched the small chest rise and fall too fast, watched the nurses surround her like a protective wall, wheeling her away, 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 through another set of doors that Maya couldn't follow through. But then had come the questions. The paperwork. The insurance cards Maya didn't have. The payment options she couldn't afford. The sympathetic but firm voices explaining that while they would stabilize Emma, anything beyond emergency care would require, they paused delicately, financial arrangements. A woman in scrubs had appeared with a clipboard. Not a nurse exactly. Someone from administration. She'd had kind eyes but a tight smile, the expression of someone who delivered bad news so often she'd learned to protect herself from it. "Mrs. Torres," the hospital administrator had said, her voice professionally kind in that way that makes you feel worse somehow. "We understand your situation. We truly do. But the treatment your daughter needs, the medication, the tests to determine what's causing these episodes. These aren't covered under emergency protocols. We need to discuss payment before we can proceed. Maya had tried to explain. She had tried to tell them about the second job she'd just started, about the payment plan she'd been promised at the clinic, about how she just needed a little more time. The words had tumbled out too fast, tripping over each other, making her sound desperate and scattered, and exactly like the kind of person hospitals probably heard from every day. People who couldn't pay. People who made promises they couldn't keep. People who were one emergency away from complete financial collapse. I worked 2 jobs, Maya had said, hearing the pleading in her own voice and hating it, but unable to stop it. I have insurance through the diner, but it's basic coverage. It doesn't cover much. But I can make payments. I can set up a plan. I just need you to help her first. Please. She's 7 years old. She's just a little girl. The administrator had nodded, had written something on her clipboard, had looked at Maya with those kind, terrible eyes. I understand, Mrs. Torres. And we will absolutely work with you on a payment plan. But before we can authorize additional treatment beyond emergency stabilization, we need to have that financial conversation. We need to understand what resources you have available, what insurance will cover, what you'll be responsible for. It's hospital policy. I'm sure you understand. But Maya didn't understand. Or maybe she understood too well. They were telling her that her daughter's life had a price tag, and until Maya could prove she could pay it, Emma would have to wait. Would have to stay in medical limbo, stabilized but not treated, alive but not getting better. But time was something Emma didn't have, and money was something Maya had run out of months ago. The first hospital bill had arrived in January. $437 for the emergency room visit when Emma had her first seizure at school. Maya had paid it over 3 months, sending them $150 each month until it was gone. Then February's bill had come. $812 for the follow-up appointment, the initial blood work, the prescriptions. She'd called the billing office, had negotiated a payment plan, had started sending them $200 a month. Then March. Then April. Then May. The bills kept coming, each one larger than the last, and Maya kept making payments, kept calling to extend her plans, kept promising she was good for it. She just needed more time. Her checking account had dwindled to double digits. Her savings, the small cushion she'd built up over years of careful budgeting, had evaporated. She'd sold her laptop, her television, the few pieces of jewelry she owned. She'd picked up the second job cleaning offices at night, sleeping 4 hours if she was lucky, running on coffee and adrenaline and the sheer terror of what would happen if she couldn't pay. And it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Now she sat in that corner, watching other families come and go, watching people with insurance cards and credit cards move through the system like water through a pipe, while she remained stuck, trapped behind an invisible wall made of numbers she couldn't reach and bills she couldn't pay. A family walked past her, a mother and father with a teenage boy between them who was holding his wrist at an odd angle. Probably broken. The mother was on her phone, talking to someone about letting the insurance company know, about making sure they went to an in-network facility. The father had his arm around the boy's shoulders, murmuring reassurances. They disappeared through the check-in desk, and 10 minutes later they were called back to treatment. Just like that. No waiting. No negotiating. No begging. Maya watched them go and felt something dark and bitter rise in her throat. It wasn't their fault. She knew that. They hadn't done anything wrong by having insurance, by being prepared, by existing in a system that worked for them. But watching them get help so easily while Emma lay behind those doors, alone and scared and waiting for treatment that might not come, it made Maya want to scream. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until she saw stars. Across the waiting room, barely visible in the shadow of a support column, a man sat alone. He wore a dark coat, expensive but understated, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was turned toward his phone, but his attention was elsewhere. He had been sitting there for almost an hour, waiting for news about his own emergency, a pregnant employee who'd been admitted with complications. He'd insisted on staying, making sure she was cared for, that her family was notified, that everything was handled. His name was Marcus Harrington, though no one in the waiting room would have recognized him beneath the cap and the exhaustion that lined his face. At 52, Marcus was the founder and CEO of Harrington Industries, a man whose name appeared on buildings and whose signature appeared on paychecks for 15,000 employees. His net worth was a number most people couldn't conceptualize, the kind of wealth that seemed abstract, impossible, almost fictional. The call had come at 1:30 in the morning. His head of security, actually, not Sofia herself. Sofia Reyes had worked as his executive assistant for 6 years, and in that time, she'd become something more than an employee. She was efficient and competent and had a way of anticipating what Marcus needed before he knew he needed it. She was also 8 months pregnant, and tonight, something had gone wrong. Preeclampsia, the security officer had said. She's at St. Catherine's. Her husband called us because he couldn't reach you. He thought you'd want to know. Marcus had thrown on clothes and driven across the city at speeds that would have gotten him arrested if anyone had been watching. He'd arrived at the hospital 45 minutes ago, had gotten the update from Sofia's husband that she and the baby were stable but being monitored, that they might need to deliver early, that the doctors were watching her blood pressure. The husband, a quiet man named David whom Marcus had met exactly 3 times, had looked shell-shocked, younger than his 30 years, and Marcus had told him to go be with his wife, that he'd wait out here in case they needed anything. So Marcus had waited. But tonight, sitting in this waiting room at 3 in the morning, Marcus wasn't thinking about boardrooms or quarterly reports or the charity gala he was supposed to attend next week. He was thinking about Sofia, his assistant's daughter, who was somewhere in this hospital fighting for her baby's life. He was thinking about how fragile everything really was, how quickly it could all fall apart, how little control anyone really had when it came down to what mattered. Money didn't matter here. Power didn't matter. His $15 billion couldn't force Sofia's blood pressure down, couldn't stop preeclampsia, couldn't guarantee a safe delivery. He'd learned that lesson 3 years ago when Catherine was dying, when all his wealth and influence had meant nothing against the cancer eating through her body, when the best doctors and the newest treatments had failed one after another until there was nothing left to try. He'd sat in waiting rooms like this one then too, had paced the hallways, had made phone calls to specialists around the world, had arranged for experimental treatments, had thrown money at the problem until he had nothing left to throw. And Catherine had died anyway. 3 years, and the helplessness still felt fresh. Still felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. Marcus shifted in his chair, trying to find a position that didn't make his back ache. He was getting too old to sleep in hospital waiting rooms. Hell, he was too old to be sitting in hospital waiting rooms at 3 in the morning, but here he was. His phone buzzed, probably his security team checking on him again, but he ignored it. His gaze drifted around the room, taking in the other people waiting. An elderly man sleeping in a corner. A young couple holding hands, both of them staring at the floor. And the woman who'd been crying. And then he heard the crying. It started soft, almost silent, the kind of crying someone does when they're trying desperately not to be heard. But in the stillness of the waiting room, it carried. Marcus looked up from his phone and saw her, the young woman in the corner, her shoulders shaking, her hand pressed against her mouth, as if she could hold back the grief that was pouring out of her. She was younger than Sofia. Late 20s, maybe, wearing what looked like a work uniform under a worn jacket. Her hair was coming loose from its ponytail, dark strands falling around her face. She'd been crying for a while, Marcus realized. Her face was blotchy, her eyes swollen. But she was trying so hard to be quiet about it, trying to muffle the sobs, trying to hold herself together even as she fell apart. Marcus found himself watching her. Not staring, exactly, but paying attention in a way he usually didn't to strangers. There was something about the way she sat, curled in on herself, clutching that purple backpack like it was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid. Something about the raw desperation in her posture that felt familiar. He'd seen that look before. In the mirror, 3 years ago. He watched as a nurse approached Maya, clipboard in hand, her expression caught somewhere between sympathy and resignation. The nurse was young, probably only a few years out of nursing school, and she looked like she'd rather be anywhere else than delivering whatever news she was about to deliver. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read the conversation in their body language. The nurse gesturing to the clipboard, her mouth moving in what Marcus recognized as the careful, apologetic tone people used when they were following policy they didn't agree with. Maya shaking her head, her hands lifting in a gesture of helplessness, palms up, empty. The universal sign of someone who had nothing left to give. The nurse's shoulders dropping slightly, a heavy breath visible even from across the room. Then words that seemed to land like stones. Maya's face crumpled. It happened in stages. First, her eyes went wide, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then her mouth opened slightly, a small "oh" of shock that Marcus couldn't hear but could see in the shape of her lips. Then her eyebrows drew together, confusion mixing with denial, her head starting to shake back and forth. No, no, that can't be right. You must be wrong. And finally, the complete collapse of whatever composure she'd been clinging to, her features dissolving into grief so profound it was almost painful to witness. She stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the purple backpack, and her voice rose, no longer trying to stay quiet, no longer caring who heard. "Please," she said, and the word broke in the middle, split into 2 syllables of pure anguish. "Please, she's 7 years old. She's having seizures. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for help. I'll pay whatever I owe. I'll work extra shifts. I'll do anything. Just please don't make me wait while my daughter—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The rest of it died in her throat, choked off by a sob that wrenched through her whole body. She pressed both hands against her face and sobbed, her whole body shaking with the force of it. The sound cut through the waiting room like a knife. The elderly man sleeping in the corner startled awake. The young couple stopped staring at the floor and looked up. Even the security guard by the door glanced over, his expression momentarily softening before settling back into professional neutrality. Marcus's hands tightened on his phone. His jaw clenched. The nurse reached out, touching Maya's arm gently, her own face showing the strain of a job that required compassion but enforced cruelty. "I'm so sorry. I truly am. But I don't make these rules. The financial department, they're the ones who—" "Then let me talk to them." Maya's voice cracked, going sharp and high, the sound of control slipping away completely. "Let me talk to someone who can make a decision. Let me explain. My daughter is back there, and I don't even know if she's okay. And you're telling me that money matters more than—" Her voice broke again, and this time she couldn't push through it. The words disintegrated into gasping breaths, into sounds that were more animal than human, primal and raw. "It's not about what matters more," the nurse said, and now her own voice was strained, defensive, the words of someone who'd had this conversation too many times and hated it, but couldn't stop having it. "It's about hospital policy. It's about insurance and liability, and, I'm sorry, I know this isn't what you want to hear, but there are protocols. Protocols. Insurance. Liability." The words hung in the air between them, cold and bureaucratic, a wall of policy erected between a mother and her dying child. Maya's legs seemed to give out. She swayed, caught herself on the back of the chair, her knuckles going white where she gripped the plastic. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came out. She looked like she was drowning, gasping for air that wouldn't come, her chest heaving. The nurse said something else, something too quiet for Marcus to hear, and then walked away. Just walked away. Left Maya standing there, trembling, barely upright, and walked back toward the double doors like she hadn't just delivered a death sentence. Marcus set his phone down slowly. His hand moved to the armrest of his chair, gripping it hard enough that the metal frame dug into his palm. He'd been in countless negotiations, countless high-stakes meetings where millions of dollars hung in the balance, where careers and companies lived or died on his decisions. He'd sat across from hostile takeover attempts and union disputes and board revolts, had faced down threats and ultimatums and power plays that would have broken lesser men. But sitting here, watching this young mother beg for someone to save her child, watching her plead and sob and break apart in a public waiting room while bureaucrats cited policy and protocols, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt helpless, and it was worse, somehow, than the helplessness he'd felt with Catherine. Because with Catherine, he'd done everything. He'd exhausted every option, pursued every treatment, called in every favor, spent every dollar he could. Maya Torres had not always been poor. That's a detail that matters, though people rarely ask about it. When you're sitting in a hospital at 3 a.m, unable to pay for your child's treatment, people don't tend to wonder about the life you had before everything fell apart. They see the worn jacket, the tired eyes, the empty wallet, and they fill in the story themselves. Single mother. Bad choices. Probably didn't finish school. Probably didn't work hard enough. But Maya had finished school. She'd graduated 3rd in her high school class. She'd been accepted to State University on a partial scholarship. She'd had plans, dreams that felt solid and real and achievable. She'd wanted to be a teacher, had imagined herself standing in front of a classroom, helping kids understand math or science or whatever subject she ended up specializing in. She'd been good at school, had liked the structure of it, the way hard work translated directly into results. Get the right answer, get the good grade. Study harder, do better. Simple. Fair. A system that made sense. The scholarship had covered 60% of tuition. Her parents had helped with the rest, proud that their daughter was the first in the family to go to college. They'd thrown a small party when the acceptance letter arrived, invited aunts and uncles and cousins, made a cake with "Congratulations, Maya" written in blue icing. Her mother had cried. Her father had made a toast about how education was the key to everything, how Maya was going to have opportunities they'd never had. She'd believed it, had felt invincible walking onto campus that first day, backpack full of new textbooks, student ID card in her wallet, a dorm room key on a lanyard around her neck. The world had felt open, full of possibility. She was going to study hard, get her degree, become a teacher, have a career, have stability, have a life that was better than the one her parents had scraped together. And then she'd met Daniel. Daniel Torres had been handsome in that easy, confident way that makes 19-year-old girls forget to be careful. He'd worked construction, had strong hands, and an easy smile, and he'd made Maya feel like she was the only person in the world when he looked at her. They'd met at a party off campus, one of those loud, crowded affairs where the music was too loud and everyone was drinking cheap beer from plastic cups. Maya had gone with her roommate, had been planning to stay an hour and leave, but then Daniel had started talking to her in the kitchen, and suddenly 2 hours had passed, and she'd forgotten why she'd wanted to leave. He was 23, had been working construction since he was 18, made decent money for someone his age. He had stories about job sites and coworkers, about the house he was going to build someday with his own hands. He talked about travel, about seeing the country, about not being tied down to one place. He made college feel small and safe and boring compared to the life he was describing. He'd asked for her number, had called her the next day, had taken her to dinner at a restaurant nicer than anywhere she'd been before, had picked her up in his truck, opened her door, paid for everything without making it feel like she owed him something. For 3 months, Maya had balanced school and Daniel, had done her homework during the day and seen him at night, had told herself she could have both, that she didn't have to choose. But Daniel didn't like her studying when they were together. Would say things like, "You're always in those books," or "Don't you ever just relax?" Would make her feel guilty for wanting to go to the library instead of spending time with him. And Maya had started choosing him more often, started skipping study groups, started turning in assignments late, started letting her grades slip because Daniel made her feel wanted in a way school never had. They'd gotten married the summer after her freshman year, and Maya had told herself it was romantic, spontaneous, proof that love could conquer practical concerns like finishing college or building a career. It had been a small ceremony at the courthouse, just them and 2 witnesses they'd pulled off the street. Daniel had bought her a ring from a pawn shop, thin gold with a tiny diamond that caught the light when she moved her hand. She'd worn a white sundress she already owned. They'd gone to dinner afterward, just the 2 of them, and Daniel had told her they were going to be happy, that they didn't need fancy degrees or career plans, that they'd figure it out together. Maya's parents had been devastated, had begged her to wait, to finish school first, to think about her future. Her mother had cried again, but this time it wasn't happy tears. Her father had refused to speak to her for 2 months. They'd eventually come around, had accepted Daniel into the family, but something had broken between them. Some trust or understanding that couldn't quite be repaired. Emma had been born 11 months later. The pregnancy hadn't been planned. Maya had been working part-time at a coffee shop, trying to save money, trying to figure out if she could go back to school part-time while Daniel worked. But then the nausea started, and the exhaustion, and the positive test that changed everything. Daniel had been excited at first, had talked about being a dad, about teaching his kid to throw a baseball or ride a bike, had painted the second bedroom of their apartment in soft yellow because they'd decided to be surprised about the gender, had assembled a crib he'd found at a garage sale, spending hours with the instruction manual and a screwdriver. For a while, it had been good. Hard, but good. Daniel worked long hours, and Maya stayed home with Emma, telling herself she'd go back to school eventually, that this was just temporary. The apartment had been small, but theirs. $550 a month for 2 bedrooms in a building that was older than Maya's parents. The paint was peeling in the bathroom. The refrigerator made a rattling sound that kept them awake at night until they got used to it. The neighbors upstairs fought constantly, their voices carrying through the thin ceiling at all hours. But they'd lived in a small apartment in the older part of town, the kind of place where the plumbing rattled and the neighbors were too close. But there had been laughter. There had been Sunday mornings with Emma between them in bed, her tiny hands grabbing at their faces. There had been hope. Emma had been an easy baby, slept through the night by 3 months, smiled early, reached her milestones on time or ahead of schedule. Maya had loved those early years in a way she hadn't expected, had discovered that being a mother felt more natural than being a student ever had. She'd read parenting books from the library, had joined a playgroup at the community center, had made friends with other young mothers who were also trying to figure it out as they went. Daniel had been good then too. Had come home from work tired but happy, had held Emma while Maya made dinner, had given her baths and read her bedtime stories in funny voices that made Emma giggle. They'd been a family, a real family, and Maya had thought maybe her parents had been wrong. Maybe you didn't need a college degree to have a good life. Maybe love and hard work were enough. And then the economy had shifted. Construction jobs dried up. Daniel started coming home later, smelling like beer and disappointment. It happened gradually, then all at once. First it was just 1 day a week when he didn't have work. Then 2 days. Then whole weeks where he'd drive to job sites only to be told they weren't hiring, that they'd laid people off, that they were barely keeping the crew they had. The money got tight. Then tighter. Then so tight that Maya started skipping meals to make sure Emma had enough to eat. The arguments started small, over bills and budgets, and whose fault it was that they were behind on rent. But they grew. They sharpened. They turned into the kind of fights where words become weapons and you say things you can't take back. Daniel would say she should get a job, that sitting at home with Emma wasn't contributing. Maya would say she was raising their daughter, that childcare cost more than she'd make working minimum wage anyway. Daniel would say maybe if she'd finished college, she'd have better options. Maya would say maybe if he hadn't pressured her to quit school, she would have. Round and round, the same fight with different words, both of them scared and angry and taking it out on each other. The beer smell got stronger. The late nights got later. Maya would lie in bed listening for his truck, wondering if this was the night he wouldn't come home at all, wondering if she should be relieved or terrified. When Emma was 3, Daniel left. Just didn't come home one day. Maya had woken up that morning to find his side of the bed empty and cold. She'd checked the bathroom, thinking maybe he'd gotten up early. Then the kitchen. Then she'd noticed his work boots were gone from beside the door. His jacket missing from the hook. She'd opened the closet and seen empty hangers where his clothes had been. That's when she'd found the note. Maya had found a note on the kitchen counter, 8 lines scrawled in his messy handwriting, saying he was sorry, saying he wasn't cut out for this, saying he'd send money when he could. The note had been written on the back of an envelope, the ink smudged in places like he'd rested his hand on it while writing. She'd read it 3 times, standing there in the kitchen in her pajamas while Emma ate cereal at the table, chattering about something she'd seen on her cartoon show. Maya had kept her face neutral, had nodded at Emma's story, had poured herself coffee with hands that shook so badly she spilled it on the counter. He never did. Send money, that is. Never called. Never wrote. Never showed up to explain or apologize or see his daughter. Just vanished like he'd never existed. Except for the ring on Maya's finger that she couldn't bring herself to take off for another 6 months, and the birth certificate in the filing cabinet with his name listed as father. Maya had tried to find him. She'd called his mother, his friends, even drove to the construction company where he'd worked, but no one knew where he'd gone, or if they did, they weren't telling. His mother had cried on the phone, said she hadn't heard from him either, said she was sorry, so sorry. His friends had been awkward and evasive, giving vague answers about how Daniel needed space or how he'd call when he was ready. The construction company had told her he'd picked up his last check 2 weeks ago and hadn't been back since. Eventually, Maya stopped looking. She had a daughter to raise and no time for ghosts. She'd filed for divorce after a year. Had to place an ad in the newspaper to notify Daniel since she had no address for him. It had cost $85 she couldn't afford, but she'd needed the closure, needed to legally end something that had emotionally ended the day she found that note. The divorce had been granted in absentia. Daniel Torres, wherever he was officially her ex-husband. She'd found work at a diner called Rosie's, the kind of place that served breakfast 24 hours a day and where the coffee was always slightly burned. Rosie herself had hired Maya on the spot. An older woman with gray hair pulled back in a bun and hands scarred from decades of kitchen work. She'd taken one look at Maya, freshly divorced and desperate, and said, "Can you start tomorrow?" The work had been hard, standing for 8-hour shifts that often turned into 10 or 12, memorizing orders, balancing plates, smiling at customers even when they were rude or demanding or left terrible tips. Her feet ached constantly. Her back hurt. She smelled like fryer grease and coffee no matter how many times she showered. The tips were decent if you smiled enough, laughed at the right jokes, pretended you didn't notice when hands lingered too long on the counter while passing money. Maya became good at pretending. She learned which customers were harmless and which ones she needed to avoid being alone with. Learned that the breakfast shift paid better than dinner, but required getting up at 4 in the morning. Learned that the truckers who came through at 3 a.m. usually tipped 20% if you kept their coffee cups full and didn't mind their crude jokes. Learned to laugh when men old enough to be her father made comments about her appearance, to deflect without offending, to extract herself from conversations that made her skin crawl without losing the tip. She became good at reading people. Could tell within 30 seconds whether a customer would be easy or difficult, generous or cheap, respectful or handsy. Could calculate her earnings for the shift by looking at who was sitting in her section. Could smile and nod and play whatever role they needed her to play so she could make enough money to keep the lights on and food in Emma's mouth. For 4 years, they'd scraped by. Emma went to the elementary school 3 blocks from their apartment. Maya worked double shifts when she could, slept 4 hours a night, and learned to make meals that cost less than $5 and could stretch for 2 days. Pasta with butter and whatever vegetables were on sale. Rice and beans. Eggs every way you could cook them. Pancakes for dinner when the month was tight. Sandwiches cut into shapes to make them more exciting. Maya became an expert at stretching a dollar, at making poverty look like normal life, so Emma wouldn't know how close to the edge they were living. They didn't have much, but they had enough. Emma was healthy. She was happy. She was growing. Emma had started kindergarten excited and eager, had made friends easily, had loved learning to read, would sound out words everywhere they went, on signs and menus and cereal boxes, had brought home artwork that Maya hung on the refrigerator, paintings and drawings that showed a happy child who didn't know they were poor. Maya had volunteered in Emma's classroom when she could, had gone on field trips, had baked cookies for class parties using ingredients she'd carefully budgeted for, had attended parent-teacher conferences where Emma's teachers said she was bright and kind and a joy to have in class, had felt, despite everything, that she was doing okay, that Emma was okay, that they were going to make it. And then, 6 months ago, everything changed. It started with headaches. Emma would come home from school and lie down on the couch, her small hand pressed against her forehead, saying it hurt. The first time, Maya had thought nothing of it. Kids got headaches. Maybe Emma had been staring at the board too long. Maybe she needed glasses. Maybe she was dehydrated. Maya had given her water and Tylenol and told her to rest. But it kept happening. 3 times that first week. Then every day. Then multiple times a day. Emma would come home from school pale and quiet, would skip playing with her toys, would lie on the couch with her eyes closed until dinner. Maya had given her children's Tylenol, told herself it was nothing, just stress from school or not enough sleep. But the headaches got worse. They came more frequently. Emma started asking to stay home from school. Started crying in the mornings, saying her head hurt too much. Started throwing up from the pain, clutching her head and sobbing until Maya's heart broke watching her. The school nurse had called, concerned. Had suggested Maya take Emma to a doctor. Had said headaches this frequent in a 7-year-old weren't normal. And then came the first seizure. Maya had been at work when the school called. The lunch shift at Rosie's. She'd been carrying 3 plates of burgers and fries to a table of construction workers when her phone rang in her apron pocket. She'd ignored it the first time, but when it rang again immediately, she'd known something was wrong. Emma had collapsed during recess. The ambulance was already on the way. The principal had been calm on the phone, but Maya could hear the fear underneath. Mrs. Torres, Emma had some kind of episode on the playground. She was running, and then she just fell. She's shaking, Mrs. Torres. Her whole body is shaking, and we can't get her to respond. Maya had run out of the diner mid-shift, still wearing her apron, and driven to the hospital with her hands shaking so hard she could barely hold the steering wheel. She'd left the plates on the table, had thrown her apron at Rosie and said, "My daughter," and run out the door. Hadn't grabbed her purse. Hadn't clocked out. Had driven 15 miles over the speed limit the whole way, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. The ambulance had beaten her there. Emma was already inside when Maya arrived, already hooked up to machines, already surrounded by doctors and nurses who were asking questions Maya couldn't answer. Did she have a history of seizures? Any family history of epilepsy? Any recent head injuries? Any exposure to toxins? No, 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 no. Maya didn't know. She didn't understand. Emma had been fine. Just headaches. How did you go from headaches to this? That first visit had cost $800, even with the basic insurance Maya's job provided. They'd run tests, found nothing conclusive, sent Emma home with instructions to follow up with a neurologist. The insurance had covered some of it. The emergency room visit, the basic tests. But there were co-pays and deductibles and things that weren't covered for reasons Maya didn't understand no matter how many times they explained it. She'd stood at the billing window, staring at the paper they handed her, seeing the number at the bottom and feeling like the floor was dropping out from under her. $800. More than her rent. More than she'd ever had in savings at one time. How was she supposed to pay $800? The neurologist appointment had taken 6 weeks to schedule and cost another $300. 6 weeks of watching Emma carefully, of keeping her home from school some days when the headaches were bad, of lying awake at night wondering if she was going to have another seizure. 6 weeks of reading everything she could find online about childhood seizures and scaring herself with worst-case scenarios. The neurologist had been kind but clinical, had examined Emma, had asked more questions, had looked at the records from the ER visit, had said they needed to rule things out, had started listing tests. MRI, EEG, blood work, genetic screening. The neurologist had ordered more tests. An MRI, blood work, scans that had names Maya couldn't pronounce. Each test had a price tag. The MRI was $1,200. The EEG was $800. The blood work varied depending on what they were testing for. The genetic screening was $4,500 and insurance wouldn't cover it at all because it was investigational. The bills had started arriving like a flood. $1,200, $2,300, $4,000. Each envelope a new weight added to a pile Maya couldn't lift. They came in the mail with logos from different companies. The hospital, the imaging center, the lab, the neurologist's office. Each one a separate bill for a separate part of Emma's care. Each one demanding payment by a certain date or else they'd send it to collections. Maya had opened each envelope with dread, had spread them out on the kitchen table after Emma was asleep, had tried to make sense of the numbers. Line items she didn't understand. Codes and procedure names. Amounts billed. Amounts covered by insurance. Amounts she was responsible for. The math was impossible. The totals K. Marcus Harrington was not supposed to be here. That was the thought running through his mind as he stood there, having just interrupted a conversation he had no part in, involving people he didn't know, about a situation that wasn't his responsibility. His security team would have a fit if they knew he'd stayed in a public hospital waiting room for over an hour without calling them. His assistant would remind him that he had a board meeting in 5 hours. His wife, if she were still alive, would have asked him what on earth he thought he was doing. His security chief, a former Secret Service agent named Robert Chun, had strict protocols. Never more than 30 minutes in a public space without check-in. Never alone in a vulnerable position. Always maintain situational awareness. Always have an exit strategy. Robert had briefed him on kidnapping statistics, on the risks faced by high-net-worth individuals, on the elaborate schemes criminals use to target the wealthy. Marcus had listened patiently to all of it, had nodded and agreed to the protocols, and then had promptly violated half of them tonight by staying in this waiting room, alone, without notifying anyone of his location beyond the initial text he'd sent 2 hours ago. His phone had buzzed 17 times with increasingly urgent messages. He'd glanced at a few of them. Sir, requesting status update. Mr. Harrington, please confirm your safety. Marcus, if I don't hear from you in 15 minutes, I'm sending a team to St. Catherine's. That last one had been 20 minutes ago. The board meeting was at 8 a.m. A critical vote on the merger with Stellar Technologies, a deal Marcus had been negotiating for 18 months. $2.3 billion. 1,200 jobs hanging in the balance. 3 board members still on the fence. Marcus needed to be there, needed to be sharp, needed to close this. He should leave, should get home, get a few hours of sleep, review his talking points one more time. Should be thinking about market projections and shareholder value and regulatory approval. But Catherine had been gone for 3 years now, and Marcus had learned that being rich and powerful didn't protect you from the things that really mattered. Cancer didn't care about your net worth. Grief didn't negotiate. And sitting here in this waiting room, watching this young mother fight a battle she couldn't win, Marcus was reminded of every moment he'd sat helpless in a hospital, watching the only person he'd ever really loved slip away despite all the money, all the doctors, all the treatments they'd tried. Catherine had been 47 when they found the lump. Stage 3 breast cancer. Aggressive, fast-moving, the kind that didn't respond well to conventional treatment. They'd done everything. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, experimental drugs that cost $50,000 per treatment and weren't covered by any insurance. Marcus had flown in specialists from Johns Hopkins, from MD Anderson, from treatment centers in Germany and Japan and Switzerland. Had arranged consultations with researchers who were years away from clinical trials. Had offered to fund entire studies if they'd include Catherine in the protocol. Nothing had worked. The cancer had spread. Lymph nodes, lungs, bones, liver. Each skin showed new spots, new areas of destruction. Catherine had withered away over 18 months, from a vibrant woman who ran marathons and chaired charity boards to a skeletal figure who could barely make it from the bed to the bathroom without help. And Marcus had sat in waiting rooms. So many waiting rooms. Had paced hallways while surgeons worked. Had held her hand during chemotherapy sessions that left her retching for hours. Had watched her lose her hair, her energy, her hope. Had seen the light go out of her eyes a little more each day. The nurse, Jennifer, looked at him with professional courtesy and mild confusion. "Sir, if you need assistance, I can help you after I finish with Mrs. Torres." She was young, this Jennifer from Patient Financial Services. Couldn't be more than 25. Probably had student loans from a state university and a one-bedroom apartment she could barely afford. Probably took this job because it paid better than retail and came with benefits. Probably hated having to be the one who told desperate people that their loved ones couldn't be treated because of money. Marcus could see it in her face. The strain, the discomfort, the way she held herself slightly back from Maya, maintaining professional distance to protect herself from the emotional weight of what she was doing. "Actually," Marcus said, "I'd like to help with Mrs. Torres's situation." The words came out steady, calm, like he was proposing a minor adjustment to a business contract rather than appending everything he'd told himself about how to approach charitable giving. His heart was hammering, though. His palms were damp inside his coat pockets. This was different from writing a check to a foundation. Different from approving a grant proposal. This was real, immediate, personal. This was stepping directly into someone's life at their most vulnerable moment and changing the course of it with nothing more than a credit card. Maya turned to look at him fully for the first time. Her eyes were red and swollen, her face pale with exhaustion, and there was a wariness in her expression that made Marcus's chest tighten. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of people who came to his foundation asking for help. The combination of desperation and suspicion. The hope that someone might actually help mixed with the certainty that they wouldn't. The way poverty and repeated disappointment taught you to expect nothing good from the world. She'd been pushed around enough tonight. The last thing she needed was another stranger inserting themselves into her crisis. "I don't need help," Maya said, her voice flat. "I need my daughter to be treated." The distinction mattered. Marcus understood that immediately. She wasn't asking for charity. Wasn't asking for a handout. She was demanding something that should have been a given, that her sick child should receive medical care. The fact that help was even necessary was an indictment of the system, not an invitation for his intervention. But he was here, and he could help. And maybe the system was broken, but that didn't mean he should let a child suffer while he worried about the philosophical implications of his assistance. "I understand," Marcus said. He pulled his hands from his pockets and stood a little straighter, trying to project calm competence without arrogance. "And I'd like to make sure that happens. Ms. Jennifer, is it? I'm willing to cover the costs of Emma's treatment. All of it. Whatever tests she needs, Whatever care the doctors recommend, consider it paid for. The words sounded surreal coming out of his mouth. Like someone else was speaking. Like he was watching himself from outside his body. He'd just offered to pay for a stranger's medical bills without knowing the cost, without any paperwork, without any of the due diligence his foundation would require before approving a $500 grant. His CFO would be horrified. His board would demand an explanation. His lawyers would have questions about liability and tax implications and proper documentation. Marcus didn't care. Jennifer blinked. "I'm sorry, who are you?" It was the obvious question. The necessary question. Hospitals couldn't accept random offers of payment without verification. But Marcus had hoped to avoid identifying himself, had hoped to handle this quietly, anonymously, without the weight of his name changing the dynamic. "Someone who wants to help," Marcus said simply. Maya stared at him. "You want to pay for my daughter's treatment? You don't even know us." Her tone was accusatory. Not grateful. Not relieved. Suspicious. Because of course she was suspicious. People didn't do this. Didn't walk up to strangers and offer to solve their problems with no explanation, no motivation that made sense. "You're right. I don't. But I've been sitting here listening, and I have the means to resolve this situation, so I'd like to do that. No strings attached. No expectations. Just, let the doctors do what they need to do for your daughter. No strings attached." Was that true? Marcus thought it was. He didn't want anything from this woman. Didn't need her gratitude or her loyalty or even her acknowledgement after tonight. Just wanted her daughter to get treatment. But was that entirely true? Wasn't there something he was getting from this? The feeling of having actually helped someone? The sense that maybe all his wealth meant something after all? The ghost of Catherine's voice telling him he was finally doing it right? Maybe there were always strings. Maybe pure altruism was a myth. Maybe everyone who helped anyone got something in return, even if it was just the feeling of being a good person. Marcus pushed the thoughts away. They were the kind of paralyzing philosophical questions that kept you from acting. And right now, a little girl needed treatment. For a moment, Maya just looked at him, her expression cycling through confusion, suspicion, and something that might have been hope before it hardened into anger. The anger was worse than the suspicion. Marcus hadn't expected anger. He'd expected wariness, questions, maybe even rejection. But the flash of rage in Maya's eyes caught him off guard. "Is this a joke?" she asked. "Did someone put you up to this?" Her voice had risen. People in the waiting room were openly watching now. The security guard had straightened, his hand moving toward his radio again. The elderly man who'd been dozing was fully awake, his eyes tracking the conversation with sharp interest. "No joke," Marcus said. "I'm serious." "Why?" Maya's voice rose higher. "Why would some random stranger offer to pay thousands of dollars for a kid he's never met? What's the catch? What do you want?" The question came out almost as a shout. Her hands had clenched into fists at her sides. Her whole body was vibrating with tension. She looked like she was deciding whether to accept his help or hit him. It was a fair question. Marcus had expected it. In Maya's position, he'd asked the same thing. Nobody did something like this without an angle, without wanting something in return. That was how the world worked, especially for people who'd been beaten down by it. Especially for people who'd learned that every offer of help came with conditions. With expectations. With the unstated understanding that you now owed someone something. That nothing was free. That kindness was always transactional. Marcus could see it in her eyes. The history of being let down. Of being used. Of accepting help that turned out to be something else entirely. A boyfriend who paid the rent but demanded control over her life. A boss who gave her extra shifts but expected her to tolerate harassment. A family member who loaned money but never let her forget she owed them. She'd learned not to trust offers of help. And Marcus had no good way to prove his intentions were genuine. "There's no catch," Marcus said. "I know that's hard to believe, but it's true. I'm here because my assistant's daughter is in this hospital with pregnancy complications. I've been waiting for news. I happened to hear your conversation, and I can help, so I want to." The explanation sounded weak even to his own ears. True, but incomplete. Not quite a lie, but not quite the whole truth either. Because yes, he was here for Sophia. But he was offering to help Maya because of Catherine. Because of guilt. Because of 3 years of writing checks that never felt like enough. Because he needed to do something that actually mattered. But how did you explain that to a stranger? How did you say, "I'm helping you because it makes me feel less empty," without sounding like you were using her pain to assuage your own? Your assistant's daughter, Maya repeated. So you're what, rich? Some kind of businessman. The way she said businessman made it sound like an accusation. Like being wealthy was proof of moral failing. And maybe she was right. Maybe there was no ethical way to accumulate billions while people like her couldn't afford to save their children. Something like that, Marcus said. He didn't want to get into specifics. His name would only complicate things, make this about him instead of Emma. But even as he said it, he knew Jennifer would need more information, would need to verify his identity, confirm he had the means to pay. He was just delaying the inevitable revelation. Jennifer had been watching this exchange with increasing uncertainty. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I need to verify. I mean, we need to follow proper procedures. I can't just, what exactly are you proposing? She was floundering, out of her depth. This wasn't in her training manual. There was no protocol for wealthy strangers offering to pay for other people's medical bills. She was probably worried about fraud, about scams, about saying yes to something that would get her fired. Marcus reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. The leather was soft, broken in from years of daily carry. It had been a gift from Catherine on their 10th anniversary. She'd had his initials embossed on the inside, where only he would see them. MJH. Marcus James Harrington. He extracted a black credit card, the kind that doesn't have a spending limit. The Centurion card. American Express Black. Invitation only. $50,000 initiation fee. $5,000 a year just to keep it. A symbol of wealth so excessive it was almost obscene. He held it out to Jennifer. Run this card for whatever amount you need to authorize Emma's treatment. Full diagnostic workup, whatever the doctors recommend, hospitalization if necessary. Consider it handled. Jennifer took the card hesitantly, looking at it like it might be fake. Her hands were shaking slightly as she turned it over, examining it. I need to check with my supervisor. This is highly unusual. Unusual. That was one word for it. Unprecedented was probably more accurate. Marcus wondered how many times in the history of St. Catherine's Medical Center someone had walked in and offered to pay for a stranger's medical bills with no explanation. Check with whoever you need to check with, Marcus said. But while you're doing that, can someone please go back there and tell the doctors they're cleared to proceed with treatment? That was the important part. Not the verification, not the billing procedures, not any of the administrative nonsense. Just getting Emma the care she needed while they sorted out the paperwork. Jennifer looked between Marcus and Maya, clearly out of her depth. Her professional composure had cracked completely. She looked young and overwhelmed, and like she wanted to call someone more senior to handle this, but was afraid that would waste more time. I'll be right back. Don't go anywhere. She hurried off toward the administrative offices, the credit card held carefully in her hand like it was a live grenade. Her heels clicked rapidly against the linoleum, the sound echoing through the waiting room. Maya and Marcus stood in silence for a moment. The waiting room around them had gone quiet, other people pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. The elderly man was smiling slightly. The young couple was whispering to each other. The security guard had relaxed his stance, but was still watching. Even the person behind the check-in desk had stopped typing and was leaning forward, trying to hear. Marcus felt exposed, vulnerable, like he'd stepped onto a stage without a script. He was used to boardrooms and negotiating tables, places where he had power and control and understood the rules. This was different. This was messy and emotional, and he had no idea if he was doing the right thing. I don't understand, Maya finally said. Her voice had dropped to normal volume, the anger draining out of it, replaced by exhaustion. People don't do this. Nobody just walks up to a stranger and offers to pay thousands of dollars. Nobody does that. She was right. People didn't do this. He'd never done this before, had never even considered doing something like this. His philanthropy had always been structured, organized, mediated through organizations and applications and formal processes. This was chaos. This was stepping directly into the mess of someone's life with no preparation, no plan, no safety net. This was the kind of impulsive decision Marcus never made. But Catherine would have made it. Would have done exactly what he was doing right now without hesitation. She'd always been the one who stopped to help strangers, who gave money to panhandlers his security team insisted were scammers, who volunteered at soup kitchens and homeless shelters despite his concerns about safety. The people who really need help aren't going to come to us, she'd said once. We have to go to them. We have to be willing to get uncomfortable, to not have all the answers, to just do what feels right in the moment. Maybe they should, Marcus said quietly. Maybe more people should do this. Why? Maya asked again, and there was a desperation in her voice now, a need to understand. Why you? Why tonight? Why my daughter? The question hung between them. Heavy, complicated, impossible to answer honestly without exposing more than Marcus wanted to expose. Marcus thought about how to answer that. He could tell her about Catherine, about the hospitals they'd gone to, the treatments they'd tried, how all his money hadn't made a difference when it really counted. He could describe the feeling of sitting in consultation rooms with the world's leading oncologists, hearing them explain why the latest treatment hadn't worked, why the cancer was too aggressive, why they were running out of options. He could talk about the experimental drug that had cost $200,000 and had done nothing except make Catherine violently ill for her last 3 months. He could explain how he'd felt powerful and helpless at the same time, able to access any treatment he wanted, but unable to save the person he loved. He could tell her about standing in rooms not unlike this one, making phone calls, pulling strings, demanding the best doctors, the newest treatments, anything that might save the woman he loved, and how none of it had worked. He remembered standing in the hallway at Sloan Kettering, screaming at a hospital administrator who was trying to explain why they couldn't include Catherine in a clinical trial because she didn't meet the eligibility requirements. Marcus had offered to fund the entire trial, had written a check for $5 million on the spot, had threatened to pull all his foundation's funding from the hospital. And it hadn't mattered. Catherine still didn't qualify. The protocol was the protocol. How she died anyway. How he'd been left with more money than he could ever spend and no one to spend it on. 3 years. 3 years of waking up alone in a house too big for one person. 3 years of attending charity galas and making speeches and smiling for photos while feeling hollow inside. 3 years of trying to find meaning in work that had once felt important but now just felt like a way to pass time until he died too. He could tell her that ever since Catherine died, his wealth had felt obscene. That he'd thrown himself into philanthropy, into foundations and scholarships and causes that sounded good in press releases but felt empty in practice. The Harrington Foundation gave away $40 million a year, funded medical research, supported education programs, provided scholarships to underprivileged students. Built. 2 hours later, Marcus was still in the waiting room. The clock on the wall read 5:30. Almost 6 hours since he'd first arrived. The night shift was ending. Marcus could see nurses changing over at the station beyond the double doors, tired faces giving reports to fresh ones. The cleaning crew had come through an hour ago, pushing their carts down the hallways, the smell of industrial cleaner mixing with the ever-present hospital disinfectant. Sophia, his assistant's daughter, had been moved to a private room on the maternity floor. The baby was stable. The mother was stable. The crisis had passed, and Sophia's family had arrived to sit with her. David had texted him updates throughout the night. For pounds 3 ounces. Tiny but healthy. They were calling her Catherine, after Marcus's late wife. David had asked permission first, awkward and formal in the text message. Marcus had cried reading it, sitting alone in this waiting room, tears he hadn't expected running down his face in the harsh fluorescent light. There was no reason for Marcus to stay. He'd done what he came to do, had made sure Sophia was cared for, had verified that everything was handled, that she had family with her, that the hospital was providing good care. He could leave. Should leave. His security team had stopped texting an hour ago, probably assuming he'd fallen asleep or lost his phone or decided to ignore them entirely. They'd be waiting for him at home, worried and annoyed in equal measure. But he stayed anyway. He'd moved to a different section of the waiting room after Jennifer and Sandra had left. Had found a corner where he could see the double doors, but was less visible from the main entrance. The baseball cap had gone back on. He'd slouched down in his seat, trying to look like just another exhausted family member rather than a billionaire who'd just paid for a stranger's medical bills. He told himself he wanted to hear how Emma was doing, wanted to make sure the doctors were following through, wanted to confirm that the financial authorization had gone through properly. But those were excuses, professional rationalizations for something more personal. He could have called the hospital later, could have had his assistant follow up, could have gotten status updates from Sandra Chun without sitting here for hours. But if he was being honest with himself, and at 3 in the morning you had to be honest about something, at 5:30 in the morning you had to be even more honest, He stayed because he needed to know that this had mattered. Not just that Emma would get treatment. He already knew that. The authorization had gone through. The doctors were running tests. The machinery of medical care was in motion. He needed to know that stepping in had made a real difference. That this wasn't just another check written to assuage his guilt about having more money than he could ever need. That Maya would be okay. That Emma would survive. That this moment in a hospital waiting room would become a story with a happy ending rather than another tragedy about a system that failed the people who needed it most. Marcus needed to see it through. Needed to not walk away until he knew. The waiting room had mostly emptied. The post-midnight rush of emergencies had cleared out. Only a handful of people remained. A couple sat in the far corner, holding hands and speaking in whispers. They'd been there almost as long as Marcus. Young, maybe mid-20s. The woman kept touching her stomach, wincing. The man kept asking if she needed anything, if he should get a nurse, if they should go back to the desk. She kept shaking her head, saying she was fine, but her face said otherwise. An elderly man dozed in a chair near the water fountain, his head tilted back, his mouth slightly open. He'd been in and out of sleep all night. Marcus had watched him wake and doze and wake again, never quite comfortable enough to fully rest. A hospital bracelet on his wrist suggested he was a patient himself, probably waiting for a ride or for morning rounds or for someone to tell him what came next. The television mounted on the wall played a rerun of some sitcom with the sound off, canned laughter silently flickering across the screen. Friends, Marcus thought. Or maybe Seinfeld. One of those shows from when television was simpler. When problems were solved in 22 minutes. When nobody died of treatable illnesses because they couldn't afford care. Marcus had taken off his baseball cap and set it on the chair beside him. His hair was probably a mess. He'd run his hands through it too many times, a nervous habit Catherine had always gently teased him about. "You'll go bald if you keep pulling at it like that," she'd say, then smooth it back down with her fingers. His phone had died an hour ago, and he hadn't bothered to find a charger. The battery had given him a 5% warning around 4 a.m. He'd watched it tick down to 0 while staring at the screen, thumb hovering over the messages he could send. Updates to his team, explanations about where he was and what he was doing. But he hadn't sent any of them. Had just let the phone die, the screen going black, leaving him disconnected from the world he usually inhabited. It felt strangely liberating. No emails. No messages. No demands on his time or attention. Just him, in this waiting room, in the strange limbo of sitting vigil for someone else's crisis. He sat in the strange liminal space of exhaustion and alertness, too tired to think clearly but too wired to sleep. His body ached. Lower back stiff from hours in plastic chairs. Shoulders tight with tension. Eyes burning. That gritty feeling that came from being awake too long. His mouth tasted stale. He needed water. Coffee. Food. Hadn't eaten since dinner, which felt like days ago but had only been 10 hours. But his mind was racing. Thoughts spinning faster than he could process them. About Emma and Maya. About Catherine and Sophia. About the system that created situations like this. About what he could have done differently. About what he should do next. The exhaustion and the adrenaline had combined into something strange. A kind of clarity that came from pushing past normal limits. Like his brain had burned through all its usual filters and defenses and was operating on some kind of emergency mode. The double doors opened, and Maya emerged. Marcus sat up straighter, watched her scan the waiting room, looking for him. She moved slowly, like every step required conscious effort. Like gravity had gotten stronger while she was behind those doors. She looked worse than before, if that was possible. Her eyes were hollow with fatigue, sunken into her face like she'd aged a decade in 2 hours. Dark circles underneath them so pronounced they looked like bruises. Her hair falling out of its ponytail completely now, strands hanging loose around her face. Her uniform rumpled and creased, the name tag hanging at an angle. A coffee stain on the sleeve that Marcus didn't remember from before. But her shoulders were straighter. Some of the desperate tension had left her frame. She no longer moved like someone bracing for the next blow. The hunched, defensive posture was gone. She walked across the waiting room with purpose, with direction, not like someone lost in a nightmare, but like someone who knew where they were going. She saw Marcus and walked over, sinking into the chair beside him with a heavy sigh. The plastic creaked under her weight. She leaned back, let her head fall against the wall behind them, closed her eyes for a long moment. Marcus waited. Let her breathe. Let her settle. Didn't push with questions. How is she? Marcus asked finally, keeping his voice low. Maya didn't open her eyes. Sleeping. They've got her hooked up to monitors, running tests. Her voice was flat, worn out from too much emotion. Scraped raw. The doctor said they're going to do an MRI tomorrow, some kind of advanced neurological scan, blood work to check for genetic markers. She paused, swallowed hard. Marcus could see her throat work. Things we couldn't afford before. Things that might actually tell us what's wrong. There was something in her tone. Not quite hope. More like cautious possibility. Like she was afraid to believe things might actually get better, but couldn't quite stop herself from imagining it. That's good, Marcus said. Yeah. Maya leaned forward, elbows on her knees, hands clasped. Her fingers intertwined, knuckles white. That same gesture from before. Gripping herself like an anchor. She woke up while I was there. Her voice cracked slightly on the word woke. Marcus heard the relief in it, the fear that had preceded that moment of Emma's eyes opening. Asked where she was. I told her she was in the hospital getting help. She said her head hurt. I told her the doctors were going to make it better. Maya's hands tightened, fingers digging into each other. I hope I wasn't lying. The last sentence came out barely above a whisper. The fear underneath everything else. That she'd made a promise she couldn't keep. That Emma would ask, did the doctors make it better? And Maya would have to say no. That this was all for nothing. You weren't, Marcus said. You can't know that. Her eyes opened, turned to look at him. Challenging. Demanding honesty. She'd been lied to enough tonight by the system, by the platitudes people offered when they couldn't really help. She didn't want false reassurance. No, he admitted. But the doctors here are good. If there's an answer, they'll find it. That was honest. That was all he could offer. Not certainty, but probability. Not a guarantee, but reasonable hope. Maya studied his face for a moment, then seemed to accept his answer. Nodded slightly. Looked away. They sat in silence for a moment. The comfortable kind, where neither person felt obligated to fill the space with words. The kind that came from shared exhaustion and shared experience. The sitcom on TV transitioned to a commercial, soundless images of cars and insurance and pharmaceutical drugs that promised to cure everything. A happy family playing in a park. An older couple walking on a beach. The perfect lives that medication could give you if you just asked your doctor about side effects and drug interactions. Marcus found himself wondering how much those ads cost. How much pharmaceutical companies spend on marketing. Whether that money might be better spent on research or subsidizing treatments for people who couldn't afford them. But he knew the answer. Of course he did. He'd sat in enough boardrooms, heard enough presentations on marketing ROI and customer acquisition costs. The money went to advertising because advertising increased sales, and increased sales meant increased profits. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work. It just didn't work for people like Maya. Can I ask you something? Maya said. Marcus turned to her. Of course. She was still looking forward, not at him. Like the question was easier to ask if she wasn't making eye contact. Why did you really do this? And please don't say because I can. There are lots of things you can do. You could have walked past me. You could have ignored me. You chose to help. Why? The same question from before, but deeper now. More insistent. She'd had time to think about it. Time to sit with Emma and process what had happened. Time to move past the immediate crisis and start trying to understand. Marcus took a breath. He'd known this question would come eventually. Had been preparing his answer in his head for the past 2 hours. But now that the moment was here, the prepared words felt inadequate. My wife died 3 years ago. Cancer. We had access to the best doctors, the best treatments, everything money could buy. It didn't matter. She died anyway. The words came out mechanical. He'd said them so many times. To business associates who asked how he was doing. To board members who offered condolences. To the grief counselor his doctor had insisted he see. The same words, over and over, until they'd lost all meaning. Until they felt like someone else's story. And ever since then, I've been, I don't know, trying to make sense of what good all this money does if it can't save the person you love most. That part was newer. More honest. Less rehearsed. He didn't usually admit that. Didn't usually let people see how much Catherine's death had broken something fundamental in his relationship with his wealth. Maya turned to look at him. Really look at him. Her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. I'm sorry. About your wife. Thank you. The response was automatic. What you said when someone offered condolences. But Maya's sympathy felt genuine, not performative. Even in the middle of her own crisis, exhausted and scared and worried about her daughter, she could still feel for his loss. But that doesn't really answer my question. Grief doesn't explain why you'd pay for a stranger's medical bills. She wasn't going to let him off easy. Wasn't going to accept the surface answer. Maya had spent 6 months fighting bureaucracy and navigating systems designed to obfuscate and frustrate. She knew how to push past polite deflections. Doesn't it? Marcus asked. He shifted in his chair, turning to face her more fully. If she wanted honesty, he'd give her honesty. I stood in hospitals like this one, watching Catherine slip away, and I would have given everything I had to save her. Every penny, every building with my name on it, every stock, every asset, everything. It wouldn't have made a difference, but I would have done it. His voice was getting rougher, emotion bleeding through despite his efforts to stay composed. And tonight, sitting here, listening to you beg for someone to save your daughter, I thought, maybe I can give you what I couldn't have. Maybe this time it can make a difference. The words hung between them. Too raw, too exposed. Marcus felt like he'd opened a wound and let Maya see inside it. But she'd asked for the truth, and he'd given it to her. So this is about your wife? Maya said quietly. Not accusatory, just stating a fact. Maybe partly, Marcus admitted. But it's also about your daughter. And about you. He looked away from her, toward the double doors where Emma was sleeping somewhere behind them. And about the fact that the system is broken, and I have the resources to bypass it, at least for one person, at least for tonight. If I don't do that, if I just sit here and let your daughter go without treatment because you can't afford it, what does that make me? Rich, Maya said bluntly. It makes you rich. That's how rich people stay rich. By not giving their money away to strangers in hospital waiting rooms. The comment should have stung. Should have felt like an attack. But Maya's tone wasn't cruel. Just matter of fact. Stating an economic reality that both of them understood. Marcus laughed, a short, surprised sound that burst out of him unexpectedly. You're not wrong. The laugh felt good. Released some of the tension that had been building in his chest. He couldn't remember the last time someone had been that blunt with him. Most people treated him with deference, careful not to offend. Maya didn't have the energy for that kind of careful navigation. I know, Maya said, and now there was the ghost of a smile on her face. I clean offices for people like you. Big glass buildings downtown. I see the nameplates on the doors. Vice presidents, executives, people who make in a month what I make in a year. She shifted in her chair, getting more comfortable, warming to the subject. And every night I empty their trash cans and vacuum their floors, and wonder if any of them ever think about the person who cleans up after them. Her voice had taken on a different quality. Not angry exactly, but pointed. Years of resentment carefully contained. If they ever wonder if that person has health insurance. If they ever wonder if that person's kid is sick. She looked at him directly. You'd be surprised what people leave in their trash. Receipts for dinners that cost more than my rent. Tickets to shows and games and vacations. Memos about bonuses and stock options. All this money just moving around, while I'm on my hands and knees scrubbing stains out of their carpet. Marcus listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't defend. Just let her talk. Some of them probably do, Marcus offered when she paused. Maybe, Maya said. But wondering doesn't change anything. Wondering doesn't pay my medical bills. Wondering doesn't keep my lights on. You're the first rich person I've ever met who actually did something. The words should have felt like praise, but they landed like an indictment. Of Marcus. Of his entire class. Of a system where one person acting was notable because it was so rare. I'm not sure that speaks well of me or anyone else, Marcus said. It doesn't, Maya agreed. It really, really doesn't. They fell quiet again. But this silence felt different from before. Less comfortable. Weighted with everything they'd both acknowledged about inequality and privilege and the randomness of who got help and who didn't. The elderly man near the water fountain woke up with a start, jerking forward in his chair. He looked around, confused for a moment, his eyes unfocused. Then recognition settled over his face. He remembered where he was. Why he was here. His shoulders slumped. He settled back into the chair, shifting to find a comfortable position, closing his eyes again. Marcus watched him and wondered what crisis he was wading through. What news he was hoping for or dreading. The doctor said the tests would take a couple days, Maya said, pulling Marcus's attention back. Emma needs to stay in the hospital. They want to monitor her, make sure the medication is working, watch for more seizures. Her hands were moving restlessly now, fingers picking at the fabric of her uniform. Nervous energy with nowhere to go. I need to call work, tell them I can't come in. I'll probably get fired. I already walked out mid-shift once this week. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just bitter resignation. And my other job, the cleaning, I'm supposed to be there in 4 hours. Marcus looked at the clock. 5:45. She was supposed to report to work at 9:30. 3 hours and 45 minutes from now. I was so worried about the medical bills, and now I'm going to lose both my jobs anyway. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He'd solved one problem only to create or reveal another. Emma would get treatment, but Maya would lose her income. Would have no way to pay rent. No way to buy food. No way to survive once Emma was released. Helping with the medical bills wasn't enough. It had never been enough. That was the problem with these systems. One crisis led to another. Solving one piece didn't solve the whole problem. What if you didn't have to work? Marcus asked. The question came out before he'd fully thought it through. But once it was out there, he committed to it. This was the logical extension of what he'd already done. Why stop at medical bills when the same problem would just manifest differently? Maya turned to him slowly, eyebrows drawn together. What do you mean? What if you had enough money to take time off? To be with Emma while she gets better? To not worry about rent or bills or losing your job? He was improvising now, making offers he hadn't cleared with anyone, committing resources without any of the usual due diligence. His CFO would be furious. His lawyers would have questions. His board would want explanations. Marcus didn't care. That's a nice fantasy, Maya said, and her voice had gone FL. 3 days passed before Marcus heard from Maya again. 3 days that felt longer than they should have. Marcus wasn't used to waiting. Wasn't used to being on the outside of situations, wondering what was happening, having no control or visibility. In business, he always had information. Always had reports, updates, metrics. Always knew what was happening with his investments, his projects, his interests. But this was different. This was personal. And he had no way to know how Emma was doing except to wait for Maya to tell him. He'd thought about calling the hospital, had even picked up his phone several times with that intention, but he'd stopped himself. The first time had been the morning after. Marcus had been in his car, being driven to the office, and had pulled up St. Catherine's number. His finger had hovered over the call button. He'd composed what he'd say in his head. Hi, I'm calling to check on a patient, Emma Torres. I'm a friend of the family. But he'd stopped. Put the phone down. Because what was he really? A friend of the family? A stranger who'd paid their bills? What right did he have to call asking about Emma's condition? Patient privacy laws probably wouldn't let them tell him anything anyway unless Maya had specifically authorized it. The second time had been Tuesday afternoon. Marcus had been in his office, staring at spreadsheets he couldn't focus on, and had decided he'd just call the billing department. Just check that the authorization had gone through properly, that there were no issues. That was reasonable. That was just due diligence. But again, he'd stopped himself. Because it would look like hovering. Like he didn't trust Maya to handle it. Like he needed to check up on her. And that wasn't what this was supposed to be about. The third time had been Wednesday morning. He'd woken up from another night of broken sleep, had checked his phone hoping for a message from Maya, had found nothing. And he'd almost called then, concern overriding his self-imposed boundaries. But his hand had frozen over the screen. Maya had his number. If she needed anything, she'd reach out. Hovering would turn kindness into control, and that wasn't what this was supposed to be about. So he'd waited, and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. All the reasons Maya might not have called. Maybe the tests had revealed something worse than expected. Maybe Emma had had another seizure. Maybe the hospital had found some reason to deny treatment despite the financial authorization. Maybe Maya was too proud to reach out again, too uncomfortable accepting more help. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept Marcus up at night, maybe Emma had died. Maybe despite everything, despite the money and the doctors and the tests, it had been too late. And Maya was dealing with grief too fresh and raw to make phone calls to strangers who'd try to help. Still, he found himself distracted during meetings, wondering if Emma's tests had revealed anything, wondering if the seizures had stopped, wondering if Maya was managing to get rest or if she was still pushing herself to exhaustion. The board meeting on Friday morning had been particularly bad. Marcus had been presenting the final case for the Stellar Technologies merger, the culmination of 18 months of work, and he'd lost his train of thought mid-sentence. Had stood there in front of the board, Slide deck frozen on the screen behind him, his mind completely blank. Marcus, one of the board members had prompted. You were saying about the synergies in the supply chain? He'd recovered, had finished the presentation, had answered questions competently, had gotten the votes he needed to move forward. But afterward, his CFO had pulled him aside. Are you all right? You seemed off in there. I'm fine, Marcus had said. Just tired. You've seemed tired for 3 days. Is something going on we should know about? No, nothing. I just haven't been sleeping well. The CFO had given him a long look. Catherine's been gone for 3 years, Marcus. I don't mean to pry, but if you're struggling, there are people who can help. Grief counselors, therapists. You don't have to do this alone. Marcus had appreciated the concern, but it wasn't grief keeping him awake. Or not just grief. Not grief for Catherine, anyway. It was worry about a 7-year-old girl he'd met once for 5 minutes while she was unconscious. Worry about a woman he'd known for a few hours in the middle of the night. Which was irrational. Marcus knew it was irrational. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. His assistant, Jennifer, a different Jennifer from the hospital, had noticed his preoccupation and asked if everything was all right. She'd caught him staring out the window Tuesday afternoon, a report open on his desk that he'd been supposed to review an hour ago. She'd knocked on his doorframe, and he'd jumped, startled. Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. I just wanted to check if you'd had a chance to look at the Quinn proposal. They're waiting for feedback. Marcus had glanced at the report. He'd read maybe 2 pages. Not yet. I'll get to it. Is everything okay? You've seemed distracted the past few days. He'd told her he was fine, just tired. She'd given him a look that suggested she didn't believe him, but was too professional to push. If you need anything, she'd said. If there's something going on, you know you can tell me, right? I can help manage things if you need some time. I know. Thank you. I'm fine. Really. But he wasn't fine. He was checking his phone constantly. Was jumping every time it buzzed. Was disappointed every time it was just another work email or message from his security team or notification from some app he'd forgotten he'd installed. On the 3rd evening, as Marcus sat in his home office reviewing documents that required his signature, his cell phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet of the room. Marcus had been reading the same paragraph for the 5th time, unable to focus, and the ring made him flinch. His hand shot out, grabbing the phone from his desk so fast he nearly knocked over his water glass. Unknown number. His heart rate spiked. It could be a spam call. Probably was a spam call. Unknown numbers were almost always spam these days. But it could also be Maya, calling from the hospital or from a borrowed phone if hers had died. He almost didn't answer, figuring it was a spam call, but something made him pick up. Some instinct. Some hope. Hello. Marcus? It's Maya. Maya Torres. From the hospital. Relief flooded through him so intensely, it was almost physical. His shoulders dropped. His jaw unclenched. He hadn't realized how tightly he'd been wound until the tension released. Maya, hi. His voice came out more eager than he'd intended. He tried to moderate it. How's Emma? She's good. Better. Better. The word hung in the air. Better was good. Better meant not worse. Better meant progress. But there was something in Maya's voice. Strain. Hesitation. Like there was more to the story. The doctors think they found what's causing the seizures. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, phone pressed against his ear. That's good news. There's a lesion on her brain, something that was probably there from birth, but only started causing problems recently. A lesion. On her brain. Marcus didn't know much about neurology, but he knew that didn't sound minor. A lesion on the brain sounded serious. Sounded dangerous. They're saying it's operable. That if they remove it, the seizures should stop. Operable. That was the key word. They could remove it. They could fix this. Emma could actually get better, not just stabilized but cured. Marcus felt relief wash over him. That's incredible news. It is, Maya agreed, though her voice was strained. Tight. Like she was holding something back. The surgery is scheduled for next week. They're saying it's a delicate procedure, but that their neurosurgery team is excellent. They're very optimistic. A delicate procedure. Brain surgery. On a 7-year-old. The risks must be enormous. One wrong move, one slip of the scalpel, and Emma could be paralyzed. Could lose cognitive function. Could die on the operating table. And Maya had to sign papers authorizing them to do it. Had to consent to letting them cut into her daughter's skull. Had to trust them with Emma's life. Marcus couldn't imagine the weight of that decision. The terror of it. But, Marcus prompted, hearing the hesitation. There was a pause. He could hear Maya breathing. Could hear voices in the background, the ambient noise of a hospital. Someone laughing. A phone ringing. The mechanical beep of medical equipment. But the surgery and the recovery and the follow-up care, it's going to be expensive. Really expensive. There it was. The real reason for the call. Not just an update. A problem. More money. Always more money. The medical system was a vampire that never stopped feeding. The financial office said they're looking at potentially over $100,000 for everything. $100,000. For a single surgery. For a few hours in an operating room and a few days of recovery. The number was obscene. Was predatory. Was designed to bankrupt families. But to Marcus it was nothing. Less than nothing. He'd spent more than that on art he didn't look at. On cars that sat in garages. On donations to galas he attended out of obligation. And I know you said you'd cover it. I know that's part of this loan. But Marcus, that's so much money. Maya's voice was climbing, getting faster, the words tumbling out like she'd been rehearsing this speech and needed to get through it before she lost her nerve. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking, Marcus said firmly. He needed to cut through her spiral before it went too far. I'm offering. I told you I'd cover Emma's treatment, and that includes the surgery. All of it. $100,000, Maya repeated, like saying the number out loud would make him understand the magnitude. Do you understand how much money that is? Did he understand? Yes and no. He understood it numerically. Understood it represented thousands of hours of labor for someone making minimum wage. Understood it was more than some people made in years. Understood it could buy a house in some parts of the country. But he also didn't understand it. Because to him, $100,000 didn't mean sacrifice. Didn't mean choosing between surgery and food. Didn't mean anything except a number that would barely register in his quarterly financial statements. I do, Marcus said. And I meant what I said. I'll take care of it. You focus on Emma and the surgery. I'll handle the billing. There was a long pause. Marcus heard Maya breathing on the other end of the line. The breaths were shaky, uneven. He heard what might have been suppressed crying, the kind where you're trying so hard not to sob that it comes out in these weird, strangled sounds. I don't deserve this, she finally said. Her voice had dropped to almost a whisper, but there was intensity in it. Anguish. Something deeper than gratitude or relief. I don't deserve someone like you showing up and fixing everything. I'm nobody. Maya, Marcus started, but she talked over him. I'm a waitress who didn't finish college and made bad choices and ended up broke with a sick kid. Each phrase sounded like an accusation against herself. Like she'd internalized every judgment the system had made about her. Every time someone had looked at her circumstances and implied it was her fault. Why me? Why does my daughter get saved when there are probably hundreds of other kids in this city whose parents can't afford treatment? Why is Emma special? It was the question Marcus had been asking himself for 3 days. The question that had been gnawing at him since he'd walked out of that hospital. The question that had kept him up at night, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with implications he didn't know how to process. He'd helped one person, one child. And how many other children had gone without treatment that same night because their mother hadn't been lucky enough to sit near a billionaire? How many were suffering right now while he sat in his comfortable home office, able to solve Emma's problem with a phone call, but doing nothing about theirs? The randomness of it felt obscene. The arbitrariness. The sheer dumb luck that had saved Emma's life. She's not, Marcus said honestly. He owed Maya honesty. She'd asked a real question, a hard question, and she deserved a real answer. Special, I mean. Or rather, she's special to you. The way every child is special to their parent. But you're right that there's nothing that makes her more deserving of help than any other kid. The words felt inadequate even as he said them. Felt like admitting to a profound moral failure. That he was helping Emma not because she deserved it more than anyone else, but because he'd happened to hear about her. Because of proximity and timing and chance. It was luck, Maya. Random chance. I happened to be there. I happened to hear. I happened to have the resources to help. And that bothers you, Maya said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. An observation. Like she could hear the guilt in his voice even over the phone. Yes, Marcus admitted. It does. He stood up from his desk, started pacing. The office suddenly felt too small. Too confining. He walked to the window, looked out at the lights of the city. Thousands of windows. Millions of people. How many of them were dealing with crises like Maya's? How many were one emergency away from financial ruin? Because you're right that the system is broken. That healthcare shouldn't work this way. That no parent should have to rely on random charity to save their child. His free hand clenched into a fist. The frustration was physical. Needed an outlet. He pressed his fist against the window, felt the cool glass against his knuckles. But I don't know how to fix the system. I don't know how to change policies or reform insurance or make healthcare accessible to everyone who needs it. And that was the core of it. The fundamental helplessness underneath the guilt. He had $15 billion, and he still couldn't fix this. Couldn't change the structures that created these crises. What I can do is help you. So that's what I'm doing. One person at a time, Maya said softly. One person at a time, Marcus agreed. The phrase had become a mantra over the past 3 days. A way to justify what he'd done. A way to make peace with helping Emma while knowing countless others went without help. That's not sustainable. You can't save everyone. No, Marcus said. The word came out heavy. Final. An acknowledgement of his own limitations. But I can save Emma. And that has to be enough. Did it have to be enough? Marcus wasn't sure. But it was all he had. All he could do. And he had to believe that mattered. That one life saved was worth something even if it didn't solve the larger problem. Another pause. Maya was processing. Marcus could almost hear her thinking, weighing, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Then Maya said, "The nurse told me who you are." "Really who you are, I mean." Marcus closed his eyes. He'd known this was coming. Had known Maya would eventually look him up, that someone would tell her. But hearing it still made him tense. Harrington Industries. $15 billion. The number sounded even more obscene when she said it. 15 billion. 15,000 millions. A number so large it stopped meaning anything. Could anyone really conceptualize $15 billion? Buildings and factories, and she showed me an article about your philanthropy. You give away millions every year. I do, Marcus said. There was no point denying it. It was public information. His foundation's tax returns were available online. Anyone could look up how much he donated and where it went. To foundations and charities and research institutions. Yes, but not to people directly. Not like this. Not usually, Marcus admitted. Why not? Maya asked. If you can afford it, if you want to help people, why not just, I don't know, find people who need help and help them? Why go through organizations? It was a good question. The question Marcus had been asking himself for 3 days. The question that had undermined years of carefully constructed philanthropic philosophy. Marcus leaned back in his chair, looking out the window of his office at the city lights stretching into the distance, and thought about how to answer. The easy answer was the one he'd been taught. The one every philanthropic advisor and foundation consultant and impact measurement specialist had drilled into him. Scale. Efficiency. Measurable outcomes. Systemic change. But standing here, after helping Maya, those answers felt hollow. Scale, he finally said. When you donate to an organization, they can help hundreds or thousands of people. When you help one person directly, you're helping one person. The math says the organization is more efficient. It was the answer he'd given himself for years. The justification for keeping distance between his money and the people it helped. The reason he wrote checks to foundations instead of standing in soup kitchens ladling soup. But you don't sound convinced, Maya said. She was perceptive, could hear the doubt in his voice even though he was trying to present this as settled philosophy. I'm not sure I am anymore, Marcus admitted. The words felt like betrayal. Betrayal of his foundation team who'd worked so hard to build effective programs. Betrayal of the advisors who'd structured his giving to maximize impact. Betrayal of the principles he'd claimed to believe in. But they were true. I've been thinking about that a lot these past few days. I've donated millions to healthcare charities, and I couldn't tell you the name of a single person they've helped. That was the damning part. He'd given away hundreds of millions over the years. Had funded clinics and research and programs that had surely helped thousands of people. And he couldn't name one of them. Couldn't tell you a single story of impact beyond the statistics in annual reports. But I know Emma's name. I know your name. I know your story. He'd thought about Emma every day since leaving the hospital. Had pictured her little face, pale and unconscious on that hospital bed. Had imagined her waking up, asking where she was, touching her head where it hurt. And that feels different. More real. Maybe less efficient, but more, I don't know, human. My daughter's life as a philosophical crisis for a billionaire, Maya said, and there was humor in her voice, dark but genuine. Sorry, I don't mean to make light of it. I'm processing. This whole thing is surreal. Marcus laughed despite himself. The absurdity of it was surreal. A waitress and a billionaire having a philosophical debate about effective altruism because he'd happened to pay her daughter's medical bills. It is for me too, Marcus said. I promise you that. And it was. He'd been operating on autopilot for 3 years. Work and philanthropy and going through the motions. This was the first time since Catherine died that he'd felt truly engaged with something. Truly uncertain. Truly questioning fundamental assumptions. Can I ask you something else? Maya said. Anything. What happens after? After the surgery, after Emma recovers, after we go home. What happens to us? Us. Like they were a unit now. Linked by. The surgery took 7 hours. Marcus spent those 7 hours pacing his office, unable to focus on work, checking his phone every few minutes even though he'd told Maya not to update him until it was over. His assistant had given up trying to get him to concentrate on meetings and had simply rescheduled everything, shooting him concerned looks that he ignored. When his phone finally rang, showing Maya's number, Marcus answered before the first ring finished. How is she? Alive, Maya said, and the word came out like a sob of relief. The surgery went well. They removed the lesion. The doctor said it was exactly what they thought it was, that they got all of it, that there's no reason to think the seizures will continue. Marcus, she's going to be okay. My baby is going to be okay. Marcus closed his eyes and breathed out. That's wonderful news. I'm so glad, Maya. I got to see her briefly, Maya continued, her words tumbling out fast. She's in recovery now, still sedated, but the doctor said her brain activity looks good, that all the signs are positive. She'll be in the ICU for a couple days, then move to a regular room. And if everything continues well, she could be home in a week. Home, Marcus. She's coming home. That's incredible, Marcus said. How are you holding up? I don't even know, Maya laughed, the sound somewhere between joy and hysteria. I haven't slept. I've been terrified for 8 days straight. And now I'm relieved but also still scared because what if something goes wrong in recovery? What if there are complications? What if? Maya, Marcus interrupted gently. Breathe. The hard part is over. The surgery was successful. Emma's strong. She's going to get through this. I know, Maya said. I know. I've been waiting for something to go wrong for so long that it's hard to believe things might actually be okay. They are okay, Marcus assured her. You can let yourself feel that. You can let yourself hope. There was a pause, then Maya said, Will you come visit? I mean, if you have time. I'd like Emma to meet you. When she's awake. I'd like her to know the person who saved her life. Marcus hesitated. He'd been trying to maintain some distance, trying to make this about them and not about him. But the genuine hope in Maya's voice, the desire to connect, to make this more than a transaction, it felt like rejecting her invitation would be rejecting something more important than he'd initially understood. I'd like that, he said. Just tell me when. Maybe in a few days? When she's more alert? Whenever you're ready, Marcus said. I'll be there. They talked for a few more minutes, Maya describing the surgical team, the ICU setup, the plan for recovery. Marcus listened, offering reassurance when she needed it, simply being present when she didn't. When they hung up, he sat at his desk feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not happiness exactly. Emma still had recovery ahead of her. Maya still had challenges to face. But for the first time since stepping into that hospital waiting room, Marcus felt like maybe this story might have a good ending. 4 days later, Marcus walked into St. Catherine's Medical Center carrying a stuffed unicorn the size of a small child. The gift shop attendant had looked at him strangely when he'd asked for the biggest unicorn they had, but he'd paid the ridiculous price without complaint and now walked through the hallways feeling slightly ridiculous but also determined. Emma Torres was on the 4th floor in room 412. Marcus found it easily and knocked softly on the partially open door. Come in, Maya called. The room was small but private, with afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. Emma lay in the hospital bed, her head wrapped in bandages, looking tiny and fragile against the white sheets. But her eyes were open and alert, and when Marcus walked in with the enormous unicorn, they went wide with wonder. Mom, look, she gasped. Look at the unicorn. I see it, baby, Maya said, smiling from where she sat in a chair beside the bed. She stood and walked over to Marcus. That's quite a unicorn. I heard someone in this room liked them, Marcus said. Are you Marcus? Emma asked. Mom told me about you. She said you're the nice man who helped us. Marcus set the unicorn on the end of Emma's bed and pulled up another chair. I am. It's nice to meet you, Emma. Your mom told me you want to be a veterinarian. I do, Emma said, brightening. I want to help animals. Dogs and cats and horses and unicorns if those are real, which Mom says they're not, but I'm not totally sure about that. Marcus glanced at Maya, who shrugged with a smile. We're keeping an open mind. For the next hour, Marcus sat with Emma and Maya, listening to Emma talk about school and her friends and the therapy dog that had visited yesterday and how the hospital food wasn't as bad as people said it was. She was bright and funny and exactly the kind of kid any parent would be proud of. Watching her, seeing how animated she was despite everything she'd been through, Marcus understood even more clearly why Maya had fought so hard. Eventually, Emma grew tired and dozed off mid-sentence. Maya adjusted her blankets and checked the monitors, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been living in hospitals. She's doing remarkably well, Maya said quietly as they stepped into the hallway to let Emma rest. The doctors are amazed at how quickly she's recovering. They're saying she might be able to go home in 3 days instead of a week. That's great, Marcus said. They walked to a small waiting area at the end of the hall and sat down. Through the windows, they could see the city stretching out below, people going about their lives, unaware of the small miracle happening on the 4th floor. I've been thinking, Maya said, about what you said. About helping one person at a time. About how it's not sustainable, but it's something. Yeah, Marcus said. What if it could be sustainable? Maya asked. What if instead of just you helping people randomly when you happen to be in the right place, there was a system? A way for people like me to connect with people like you who want to help. Marcus looked at her. What are you suggesting? I don't know exactly, Maya admitted. But there are millions of people out there who can't afford medical treatment. And there are, well, maybe not millions but thousands of wealthy people who donate to charity. What if there was a way to connect them directly? Not through big organizations with administrative costs, but person to person, family to family. Like crowdfunding? Marcus asked. Sort of, but more personal. More accountable. I read about your foundation while I was sitting with Emma. You give away millions to healthcare organizations. But you said you can't name a single person they've helped. What if you could? What if every donation had a name and a face and a story? Marcus leaned back, considering. It's an interesting idea. The challenges would be verification, making sure people weren't scamming the system, managing expectations about who gets helped and who doesn't. It could be messy. Life is messy, Maya said. But messy doesn't mean not worth doing. Emma is alive because you happened to be in that waiting room. How many kids aren't alive because no one was there? How many families are drowning because they didn't get lucky? Too many, Marcus said. So let's change that, Maya said. Let's create the luck. Let's build something that makes these connections possible. I don't have money or resources or any idea how to actually do this. But you do. And I have the experience of being on the other side, of knowing what people like me need and what barriers exist. Together, maybe we could figure something out. Marcus studied Maya's face, seeing the determination there, the hope. 3 weeks ago, she'd been an exhausted waitress begging for help in a hospital waiting room. Now she was talking about changing systems, about creating solutions. Crisis had forged her into something remarkable. You know this would be complicated, Marcus said. Starting something like this would take time and resources, and there's no guarantee it would work. I know, Maya said. But shouldn't we try? Shouldn't someone try? Marcus thought about Catherine, about her last words asking him not to waste his life. He thought about the foundation he'd built in her name, about all the grants and donations and programs that felt abstract and distant. He thought about Emma, sleeping in a hospital room, alive because of a chance encounter. Yes, he said. Someone should try? Let's talk to my foundation team. Let's see if we can figure out a model that works. No promises that it'll be successful, but we can try. Maya's face lit up. Really? You'd actually consider this? I'd more than consider it, Marcus said. I think it might be exactly what I've been looking for. A way to make the money matter. A way to actually help instead of just writing checks and hoping. A way to save more Emmas, Maya said softly. A way to save more Emmas, Marcus agreed. They sat together in the waiting area, watching the city below, both of them imagining a future where moments like the one they'd shared in that emergency room didn't have to rely on luck, where help was accessible, where systems existed to catch people before they fell too far, where wealthy people who wanted to make a difference could connect directly with people who desperately needed that difference made. It was ambitious. It was probably overly optimistic. There would be challenges and setbacks and moments when it all seemed impossible. But sometimes, Marcus thought, the most important things to do were the impossible ones. The things that required you to step out of your comfort zone, to take risks, to believe that change was possible even when all evidence suggested otherwise. When Emma's better, Marcus said, when she's home and settled, come to my office. Bring the ideas you've been thinking about. We'll sit down with my team and start figuring this out. Okay, Maya said. I will. Thank you, Marcus. For everything. For Emma. For me. For believing this could be something. Thank you, Marcus replied. For reminding me why any of it matters. They walked back to Emma's room together. The little girl was awake again, hugging her giant unicorn and looking out the window at the sky. When she saw them, she smiled. And that smile contained so much hope and joy and possibility that Marcus felt his chest tighten. This was what mattered. This moment. This child. This family. Not the billions in his bank account or the buildings with his name on them or the quarterly reports and board meetings. This. Marcus. Emma called. Can you tell me about unicorns? Like, what do you think they eat? Marcus laughed and pulled his chair back to Emma's bedside. Well, I imagine they eat rainbows and dreams, and probably some regular grass too, because even magical creatures need fiber. Emma giggled. That's silly. You're probably right, Marcus agreed. What do you think they eat? As Emma launched into an elaborate theory involving sparkles and clouds and special unicorn vegetables, Marcus caught Maya's eye. She mouthed, "Thank you," one more time, and he nodded. No, he wanted to say, "Thank you. Thank you for being brave enough to fight for your daughter. Thank you for forcing me to pay attention. Thank you for reminding me that wealth is only valuable if you use it to help people who need it. Thank you for giving me a purpose again." But those words would have to wait. Right now, there was a 7-year-old girl who wanted to discuss unicorn dietary habits, and honestly, Marcus couldn't think of anything he'd rather be doing. Like the video, leave a comment, and tell us where you're watching from. And subscribe to Stories by _BB.